The Strait of Hormuz just closed, 20% of the world's oil supply blocked, and Alberta just became the most important energy producer on the planet. Let me show you why. Right now, over 700 tankers are stranded outside a narrow strip of water between Iran and Oman. Ships carrying 20 million barrels of oil that normally flow through every single day. Stopped, waiting, unable to pass. Oil prices are surging toward $100 per barrel. China, India, Japan, South Korea, they receive almost 70% of their oil through that choke point. Now they're scrambling, desperate for alternatives, looking for any stable supply they can find. And where is one of the largest, most reliable oil reserves in the Western world? Alberta, 4.1 million barrels per day, 167 billion barrels in the ground, direct pipeline access to the Pacific Ocean. Every bomb that falls on Iran makes Alberta more valuable. Every day that Strait stays closed, Alberta's leverage grows. This is what nobody in the mainstream media is talking about. The Iran crisis isn't just a Middle East story, it's an Alberta story. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why Ottawa is about to realize they need Alberta far more than Alberta needs them. Here's what happened. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes across Iran. Military bases destroyed, nuclear facilities hit. And in the opening hours, Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed. Iran's response was immediate. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps broadcast a warning on international maritime frequencies. Quote, "No ship is allowed to pass the Strait of Hormuz. Within hours, tanker traffic dropped by 70%. By March 2nd, it dropped to nearly zero. Insurance companies pulled coverage for any vessel attempting the crossing. Shipping giants like Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd suspended all transit indefinitely. At least 5 tankers have been attacked near the strait. 2 crew members killed. Vessels set ablaze. The strait is technically still open, but effectively, it's a war zone, and no commercial operator will risk it. Now, let me put this in perspective. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 2 shipping lanes, 3 miles each. That's it. That's all that separates the Persian Gulf from the rest of the world's oceans. And through this tiny choke point flows 20 million barrels of oil every single day, 1/5 of global supply, more than any other maritime passage on Earth. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Iran. All of them depend on this strait to get their oil to market. Without it, their oil is trapped. Now here's the part that changes everything for Alberta. Saudi Arabia has one pipeline that bypasses the strait, the East-West pipeline. Capacity? About 2.5 million barrels per day. 2.5 million to replace 20 million? That's 12% of what's needed. The math doesn't work. There's no backup plan. OPEC has promised to increase production by 200,000 barrels per day. That's 1% of the shortfall. Symbolic. Meaningless in the face of an actual closure. The strategic petroleum reserves in the United States and Europe can cover a few weeks, maybe a month, but they're designed for short-term emergencies, not a prolonged conflict, which means the world has exactly one real option. Find alternative supply, pipelines that don't run through war zones, producers that aren't caught in the crossfire, and that's where Alberta enters the picture. Alberta's oil doesn't have to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. It doesn't have to dodge Iranian missiles or navigate insurance blacklists. Alberta's oil flows through the Trans Mountain Pipeline, 890,000 barrels per day, from Edmonton to the Pacific coast of British Columbia. From there, tankers reach Japan in 15 days, South Korea in 17, China in 3 weeks. That's faster than Persian Gulf oil, even when the strait is open. Before Trans Mountain expanded in 2024, Alberta's oil exports to Asia were essentially zero. By October 2025, they reached $1.1 billion. And that was before the Strait of Hormuz closed. Now, Asian buyers aren't just interested in Alberta oil, they're desperate for it. But here's the irony that should keep Ottawa politicians awake at night. For the past decade, the federal government did everything possible to strangle Alberta's energy industry. They blocked the Northern Gateway pipeline, killed it completely. They delayed Trans Mountain for so long the government had to buy it themselves just to get it built. $34 billion of taxpayer money because private investors gave up. They let Keystone XL die without a fight. They imposed carbon taxes that made Alberta oil more expensive to produce than almost any competing barrel on the market. They passed regulations designed to phase out the oil sands entirely. Ottawa spent years treating Alberta's oil like an embarrassment, something to apologize for at international climate conferences, while quietly collecting the tax revenue. And now the Strait of Hormuz is closed. Oil prices are surging past $80 and climbing. The world is scrambling for alternatives. And suddenly, Ottawa remembers that Canada is sitting on one of the largest energy reserves on Earth. Funny how that works. Let me give you the numbers that matter. Alberta produces 4.1 million barrels of oil per day, a new record set in 2025. December peaked at 4.4 million. That's 84% of all Canadian oil production from one province. The oil sands contain 167 billion barrels of proven reserves. That's the third largest in the world, behind only Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. And unlike Venezuela, Alberta has political stability, rule of law, functioning infrastructure. Unlike Saudi Arabia, Alberta doesn't depend on a choke point controlled by a hostile power. Alberta is arguably the safest, most reliable large-scale oil producer left on the planet, and the world is just now figuring that out. But here's what this crisis really means for Alberta's independence movement. Leverage. Before February 28th, Ottawa could pretend Alberta was dispensable. They could extract $20 to $28 billion a year in net fiscal transfers and lecture Albertans about carbon emissions. They could delay pipelines, impose taxes, and act like Alberta should be grateful to be part of Canada. That calculation just changed. Every day the Strait of Hormuz stays closed, Alberta's oil becomes more valuable. Every dollar oil prices rise, Alberta's treasury grows. Every scramble for alternative supply reminds the world that Alberta has exactly what they need. And the referendum signatures being collected right now for October's vote, they just became a lot more powerful. Because here's the math Ottawa has to consider. If Alberta leaves, Canada loses its largest oil producer. 4 million barrels per day, gone. The tax revenue from the highest GDP per capita province in the country, gone. The trade leverage that comes from being a major energy exporter, gone. Before the Strait of Hormuz closed, Ottawa could argue Alberta needed Canada for stability, for trade access, for international recognition. That argument just collapsed. The world isn't knocking on Ottawa's door. The world is knocking on Alberta's door, asking for oil, offering contracts, looking for long-term supply agreements. Alberta doesn't need Ottawa to access global markets anymore. Trans Mountain connects Alberta directly to Asia. The Enbridge Main Line connects to the United States. Pipeline expansions are already in progress. The question is no longer whether Alberta can survive alone. The question is whether Canada can survive without Alberta. And with the Strait of Hormuz closed, with oil prices surging, with Asian buyers desperate for every barrel of stable supply they can find, the answer is becoming clearer by the day. Ottawa spent a decade trying to strangle Alberta's energy industry. Now they're watching the world prove exactly how much that industry is worth. The math changed. The leverage shifted. And Alberta is holding cards Ottawa didn't even know were in the deck. Now let me show you what happens next, because the implications go far beyond oil prices. The moment that strait closed, a clock started ticking in Ottawa, and they don't have much time. Here's the scenario playing out right now in boardrooms across Asia. China imports 40% of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. India imports over 60%. Japan and South Korea are almost entirely dependent on Middle Eastern crude. These aren't small economies. These are the factories of the world, the shipping hubs, the manufacturing centers that produce everything from electronics to automobiles. When their oil supply gets cut off, they don't politely wait for diplomacy to work. They panic. They bid against each other. They lock in long-term contracts with any producer who can guarantee delivery. And right now, the phone is ringing in Calgary. You think I'm exaggerating? Look at what already happened. Before Trans Mountain expanded, Alberta's oil exports to Asia were zero, nothing. The pipeline didn't have capacity, and tanker access was limited. By October 2025, Alberta was exporting over $1 billion worth of crude to Asian markets. In less than 18 months, that growth happened during peacetime, with the Strait of Hormuz fully open, with Persian Gulf oil flowing normally. Now imagine what happens when 20% of global supply disappears. Every barrel Alberta can ship to Asia just became strategic, essential. The kind of resource that countries fight wars over. And Alberta has millions of barrels to spare. But here's what makes this moment truly unprecedented. The last time oil markets faced a disruption this severe was 1973, the Arab oil embargo. OPEC cut off supply to the United States and prices quadrupled overnight. That crisis reshaped global politics for a generation. It created the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It launched a decade of energy policy reform. It made energy security a core national interest for every Western government. This crisis is potentially 3 times worse. The Arab embargo affected about 5 million barrels per day. The Strait of Hormuz handles 20 million. If this closure lasts weeks instead of days, the economic shockwaves will be catastrophic. And here's the part that should terrify Ottawa. Canada isn't ready. For years, the federal government bet everything on transition. Wind farms, solar panels, electric vehicles, a future where oil didn't matter. They didn't build new pipelines. They didn't expand refining capacity. They didn't stockpile reserves. They didn't prepare for a world where oil suddenly became the most valuable commodity on Earth. Alberta did. Alberta kept producing, kept investing, kept expanding capacity, even when Ottawa tried to shut them down. And now Alberta is sitting on exactly what the world needs, while Ottawa is sitting on climate pledges that don't pump a single barrel. Let me tell you what's happening in Asia right now. Japanese trading companies are scrambling to secure long-term supply contracts. South Korean refiners are calling every producer outside the Persian Gulf. Chinese state oil companies are mapping every pipeline route that doesn't touch the Middle East. Trans Mountain terminates at Westridge Marine Terminal in Burnaby. From there, tankers can reach Yokohama in 15 days, Busan in 17, Shanghai in 21. That's the new supply chain. That's the backup plan. That's where Asian energy security now depends, and it runs directly through Alberta. But here's the question nobody in Ottawa wants to answer. Why should Alberta share? Seriously, think about this from Alberta's perspective. For 60 years, Ottawa took Alberta's wealth and redistributed it east. $20 to $28 billion a year in net fiscal transfers. Money that built Quebec's daycare system, money that funded Ontario's healthcare, money that kept the Maritimes afloat. And in return, pipeline cancellations, carbon taxes, regulatory delays, lectures about the environment from politicians who heat their homes with Alberta natural gas. Now suddenly, Alberta has something the entire world wants. The most valuable resource in the most valuable market at the most critical moment. And Ottawa expects Alberta to just keep sharing? The referendum signatures being collected right now aren't just about grievances anymore. They're about leverage, real leverage, the kind that comes from controlling something the world desperately needs. Here's what independence looks like in this scenario. An independent Alberta signs direct trade agreements with Japan, South Korea, and China. No Ottawa middleman, no federal regulations, no carbon tax skimmed off the top. An independent Alberta keeps 100% of royalty revenue, not 50% after equalization, not 70% after federal taxes, all of it. An independent Alberta expands pipeline capacity without waiting 10 years for federal approval. The proposed West Coast oil pipeline, 1 million barrels per day to Prince Rupert, direct access to Asia without going through Vancouver. An independent Alberta sets its own environmental standards. Reasonable standards. Standards that balance production with sustainability instead of strangling the industry entirely. That's not a fantasy. That's a business plan. And with the Strait of Hormuz closed, it's a business plan that every energy investor on Earth would fund tomorrow. But let me tell you what happens if Alberta stays. Ottawa will promise reform. They always do. They'll talk about pipeline acceleration and regulatory streamlining and respecting Western interests. Then the crisis will pass, the strait will reopen, oil prices will stabilize, and everything will go back to exactly how it was before. More delays, more taxes, more transfers east, more lectures about transition while Alberta's wealth funds programs Albertans never voted for. That's not speculation. That's history. That's what happened after every oil boom and every Western grievance for the past 50 years. Ottawa makes promises during the crisis. Ottawa breaks promises when the crisis ends. The only thing that changes the pattern is leverage, real leverage, the kind that doesn't disappear when oil prices stabilize. And right now, Alberta has more leverage than any province in Canadian history. Here's the math Ottawa is trying to avoid. Canada's federal budget depends on Alberta's economy. Corporate taxes from oil companies, income taxes from high-earning energy workers, GST from the spending that oil wealth generates. Take Alberta out of the equation, and the federal budget doesn't balance, not even close. Take Alberta out during an energy crisis, and Canada becomes an international laughingstock. A country that couldn't keep its largest economic engine because it spent too long taking it for granted. Now add the referendum, October 2026. That's when the vote could happen. If the signature threshold is met, and all signs suggest it will be, Albertans will face a clear question. Do you want to remain part of a country that spent decades undermining your industry? Or do you want to control your own future at the exact moment that future has never been more valuable? The Strait of Hormuz didn't cause Alberta separatism. That sentiment has been building for generations. But the Strait of Hormuz just gave that sentiment something it never had before. Perfect timing. The world needs oil. Alberta has oil. Ottawa spent years trying to prevent Alberta from selling oil. And now Alberta is asking whether Ottawa deserves a cut of the profits. That's the question. That's the calculation. And for the first time in Canadian history, the math favors Alberta. Let me leave you with this. Crises reveal truth. They strip away pretense and expose what actually matters. For decades, Ottawa pretended Alberta's oil was a problem, an environmental liability, something to be managed and eventually eliminated. The Strait of Hormuz just proved that was always a lie. Oil isn't a problem. Oil is power. Oil is leverage. Oil is the foundation of the global economy, and it will be for decades to come. Alberta has that power. Alberta has that leverage. And Alberta is finally asking why it should share that power with a government that spent years trying to destroy it. The strait closes, the world scrambles, and Alberta realizes the truth. They don't need Ottawa. Ottawa needs them. The referendum just became a lot more interesting. The math just changed, and October's coming.